senses are the feeders of raw data into the computer of the mind. So, what really is it that does the hearing? Is it the ear? Or is it the brain? Or is it both? Scientists have been proposing answers to questions like that for a long time. And philosophers ponder whether or not there's a noise in the forest when a tree falls and there's no ear or brain around to hear it. Of course, there are actually many aspects of reality that are absolutely undetectable to our five human senses. For example, think of carbon monoxide gas. It makes no noise, it leaves no scent, it has neither taste nor feel, and it is perfectly invisible, and it will kill you dead. We're aware of it because of the effects it has on other things that we can detect, like the capacity of human blood to carry oxygen. And so we make transducers, mechanical sensors, so that they tell us when it's around by transforming its invisible energy into a more visible form, like a red light or a warning beep. Now think about this. How much of reality, like carbon monoxide, lies beyond the ability of our five senses to perceive it? If we can't detect it, and we can't build a transducer to detect it for us, does that mean that it's not real? Is it possible that there could be reality all around us that we are not even aware of simply because we can't sense it? Imagine for a moment there is a thing called unsensed reality. We can't see it, we can't smell it, but it's every bit as real as carbon monoxide gas, and there are no instruments able to detect it. And then imagine if by some quirky circumstance we were suddenly able to acquire the ability to sense it, how would our brains interpret it? Or could they even interpret it? Would our brains be able to process this kind of heretofore undetectable and therefore thoroughly alien data? Or would they simply shift into overload and say, this does not compute? These are questions that have enormous bearing upon the culture that we're living in today. And they have enormous relevance for this thing that we call faith. Faith, Paul says in the 11th chapter of Hebrews, is the evidence of things not seen. And I think that we would be safe to add here, it's also evidence of things not heard, nor smelled, nor tasted, nor felt either. Faith is the evidence of things that we have no human ability to detect or measure with our man-made sensors. Faith is the ability to detect unsensed reality. It's almost like a sixth sense, like a transducer capable of directly sensing things beyond the physical realm. Again, if human beings were to suddenly get some brand new ability, for example, if we suddenly were able to hear microwave radiation, how would we, or even could we, make sense of that? You might think such a question is impossible to answer, but what if it's not? What if we could answer it by answering another one that's not so impossible? What about people with sensory deficits who have learned to understand reality based on a severely limited sensory input, right? And then they suddenly experience a kind of healing, like a deaf person who is given cochlear implants, a person who has never heard a sound before and suddenly hears a Chopin prelude being played in all its glorious nuance of sound and beauty. Does that person somehow know that this new audio data streaming in, this alien data coming into her brain, does she know that it's Chopin? And can she perceive its beauty? And more intriguing than that, How does this alien noise she is suddenly hearing gel with everything else she has decided about reality up to that point? Will she have to redefine reality that she has known? Now let's switch the illustration. What if it's not hearing we're thinking about? What if it's sight? Computer designers know that what really chews up microprocessor bandwidth is images, all right, graphics. If all we needed computers for was email and word processing and spreadsheets, they'd all be about the size of a wristwatch. But when you start adding pictures, and then high-resolution pictures, and then moving pictures, and then high-definition, fast-moving video, you need huge amounts of both memory and microprocessing power. It shouldn't surprise us that the human brain works exactly the same way. Some experts say that fully a third of the cortical processing of the human brain is spent interpreting the raw data that streams in through the eyes. Vision, in other words. And sight plays an enormous role in our understanding of the world. With all that in mind now, let me share with you the first fascinating story. On a sunny spring morning in 1957, Origene May sent her two small children, 4-year-old Diane and 3-year-old Mike, out to play. Mike and Diane decided they wanted to make mud pies. Mike needed a container to mix the mud, so he headed for the garage where he spied a quart mason jar, perfect for the task. But the jar was filled up with a hard, dry powder, so it would have to be cleaned. He took the jar to a cement horse watering trough near the garage and plunged it under the water. A stinky plume of gas began to rise, and then the jar suddenly exploded. Mike's mother ran to the backyard and found her little boy writhing in a pool of blood, glass shards filling his face. The mason jar had exploded. On the way to the hospital, Origene pleaded with God that her son might live. But after hours of work, the surgeons came out and said he probably would not. But Mike May was no ordinary little boy, and he did not die. He remained in the hospital for 3 months, his head swathed in bandages, and when they finally came off, he could no longer see. He had been completely blinded, 100%. No shadows, no anything. It wasn't the glass that destroyed Mike's eyes. It was the chemical that had been in the jar, calcium carbide, carelessly left behind by the former owner of the house. It took a year for Mike to heal enough to get out of bed. A social worker advised Origene to get blindness and mobility training for her son. The following year, her doctor told her that they ought to send Mike away to a school for the blind. That's what happened to blind children in the 1950s. But that's not what happened to Mike May. His mother had already had way more than her share of adversity and adventure in her short life, and she decided Mike would go to normal kindergarten and participate in normal activities. And when the social worker asked her what activities she considered to be normal, she replied, all of them. At home, Mike climbed out of his recovery bed and into his new world. It didn't look black to him. It just looked like nothing. He learned to climb kitchen cabinets and run down toy-littered hallways, a constant ballet of tripping and colliding he hardly seemed to notice in his excitement to get to the next place. Mike felt no surprise or sadness at not being able to see. To his 4-year-old brain, he just was who he was. On his first day of school, his mom handed him a lunch and put him on the bus. When the class stood for the pledge, they had to orient him in the right direction. On the playground, he walked in front of kids on the swing set and got bashed in the head. Instead of crying, he asked himself the question, where did that come from? At the end of his first day in school, he described his day to his mother, and his mother said, "Mike, that sounds like a lot of fun." Every bit of the world thrilled Mike. Everywhere he went, he ran. And for a blind person running, there are a million things to crash into. Mike crashed into all of them. But he thrived in kindergarten. At the end of the year, the school district told Origine that Mike would not be permitted to enroll in first grade. So, Origine searched until she found one of the very few schools in the United States at that time that mainstreamed blind kids with sighted kids. And she moved her family there. At home, Mike was not exempt from family chores. He was expected to pull his full weight, and he did. He learned to cook. He learned to vacuum. He developed an ability to remember precisely where he had been in a room or a building or a playground, to remember precisely how he had gotten there, and so he could get back there again. On the playground, he learned how to play kickball, and he became a killer competitor at hide and seek. When he fell down or crashed into things, he bled. But he wasn't afraid of blood, so he kept on trying, and he kept on learning. And then came the day that Mike learned to ride a bicycle. He crashed for 2 days straight. His arms and legs were covered in scrapes and bruises and blood. He asked his mom how she thought he was doing. She said, "Mike, I think you're getting there." Eventually, Mike mastered the bicycle. He did it by gauging the feel of the wind on his face and the sounds of the tires, and listening for directions from friends riding in front. Without knowing it, Mike was developing a very acute sense of hearing, even being able to navigate complex physical situations using a kind of echolocation. He learned how to tell precisely where his classmates were looking by how the sound came from their mouths and bounced off the walls. At school, his resource teacher was every bit as hard on him as his mom was. She allowed him to get by with nothing. Mike chose not to hang out with the other blind kids. Instead, he did everything with the sighted kids. They became his friends. He made up his mind he could learn to do everything they could do, and to that task, he set his life. In 5th grade, Mike applied for the school safety patrol, students who did crossing guard duty for younger kids crossing the street. They told him no. It was impossible for a blind person to be a crossing guard. Mike and his resource teacher appealed it all the way to the school board. They wanted to know how he could do it. By sound, he told them, and then he proceeded to demonstrate. Mike won his appeal. He became a school crossing guard, never lost a student to a traffic accident. Near the end of grade school, Mike asked his mom for permission to take his bike and ride by himself to downtown Walnut Creek. It was a 3-mile trip in traffic. Origine's stomach turned with visions of ambulances and mangled limbs. Instead, she heard herself saying, "Mike, it's important to stay on the right side of the road, pull over when you hear traffic, and if it gets too hard, don't be afraid to turn back." But she knew he wouldn't be back. Standing by the mailbox in her cul-de-sac driveway, Origine fought back tears as she watched her blind 11-year-old son pedal away into traffic and disappear around the corner. 3 hours later, he was back. She fought the urge to ask him how the trip had gone because she didn't want to make it seem like a big deal, because to Mike it wasn't a big deal. And that's how Mike May lived his life as a blind person. He maintained a 3.5 GPA, became a champion wrestler. When a friend introduced him to the world of ham radio, Mike decided he needed to have a set too, so he built himself one. He also needed a transmission tower, so he built one of those too, climbing 80 feet up into the air to assemble it piece by piece as his mom watched and bit her lip from the kitchen window. In college, Mike discovered three things: the thrill of business, the thrill of skiing, and the thrill of girls. With a friend, he learned to ski, and skiing became a passion. He majored in electrical engineering because, he said, there aren't very many blind electrical engineers. And he began his first serious relationship. Eventually, he succeeded at all three. In the world of skiing, he became a champion. With a sighted friend, he pioneered new techniques of blind skiing. Normally, a blind skier skis first, with the sighted skier following and shouting turning directions from behind. But that's necessarily slow because the sighted skier has to stay behind. Mike and his partner mixed it up, with his partner going ahead and Mike staying right on his tail, primarily by listening to the sound of his partner's skis on the snow. That way he could go as fast as his partner chose to go. All the conventional wisdom of the day, including the Olympic National Committee, told them it was much too dangerous. Mike said, well, skiing the old way is just much too slow. They did it Mike's way. In the world of engineering, Mike became an entrepreneur. He formed a group of partners, and they invented stuff. Stuff like an electronic gadget that used lasers instead of needles to read the grooves in vinyl records. A technology that eventually found its way into things that we know as CD players and DVD players. Along the way, Mike mastered the use both of the guide dog and the cane, going everywhere with confidence. His secret was that he was never afraid to get lost, and therefore there wasn't any place that he wouldn't go. His business took him all over the world, and whenever he traveled alone. In the world of relationships, Mike eventually found the woman with whom he would share his life. He and Jennifer were married, and they had 2 sons. Mike May's life was near picture perfect when, on February 11th, 1999, he made his way to the dais in the ballroom of San Francisco's St. Francis Hotel. He was there to present the prestigious Kay Gallagher Award for mentoring blind people, an award that he had won the previous year. Dozens in the audience knew his story that day. A 46-year-old businessman, blinded at the age of 3 in a freak accident, former CIA agent, for a 3-time Paralympic gold champion and world record holder at downhill skiing at speeds over 80 miles an hour, a world-class entrepreneur on the verge of bringing a portable GPS system to market for blind people, co-inventor of the world's first laser turntable, married to a gorgeous blonde wife, loving father of 2. People watched as Mike May moved. He walked with a quiet dignity, effortlessly negotiating the obstacle course of tables and chairs, smiling at those he passed, shaking hands along the way. His gait seemed free of regret, his body language devoid of longing. Most people in that room had worked with blind people every day, so they knew what it was like for a blind person to long for vision. But Mike looked exactly like who he wanted to be, because he was perfectly satisfied with his life. It was full, rich, and there was no longing in his soul to see anything. But his amazing life was about to change. The next day, while accompanying his wife to an ophthalmologist appointment, the doctor offhandedly asked if Mike needed a checkup. And just as offhandedly, Mike said, well, sure, why not? 15 minutes later, the doctor dropped the bombshell. There was a new and very experimental pair of surgeries prescribed for very rare cases just like his. And it had the potential to give him his sight back 100%. Would he like to come back for some tests to determine if he was a candidate? Now, you would expect a blind person to jump for joy and lunge at such a chance. Mike did not. His life was already so full. He was happy and fulfilled and satisfied, not to mention the fact that his business and his family kept him incredibly busy. So it took him 8 months just to decide to come back for the tests. But when he did, the results were definitive. He was a prime candidate for the surgeries. Although there were some risks, the promise was unequivocal. After 44 years of total blindness, Mike May could have the opportunity to see the world if he wanted to. What would he do? What would you do? What would you choose to do if you were suddenly offered a new sense that had the potential of redefining the world you had come to understand and love? Would you take it? These are the kind of questions that Mike May wrestled with. He talked to his wife. He talked with friends. In particular, he talked to one of his best friends who was also blind, and as it turned out, who also was a candidate for the very same pair of surgeries. Mike concluded that all the reasons he could think of to either have the surgeries or to not have them, all the reasons fell on the side of not having them. The risk of tissue rejection, the risk of cancer caused by the drugs, the lost time from his business, the reasons to say no went on and on and on. In the history of the world, there have only been a handful of people known to receive sight after a lifetime of blindness. And although the case studies of those people were available to him, and although his blind friend had read them, Mike May, for some reason, chose not to read them. If he had, he would have discovered that in every case, restored sight had been a huge disappointment to the person receiving it, leading to severe and prolonged depression, and nobody knew why. Had Mike read those studies, he might have decided, as his friend decided, not to have the surgeries. There was, however, one reason he could think of for saying yes, and in the end, that reason trumped all the others. He was simply curious. Curious. In fact, it was his curiosity about the world that had propelled him to do so much that blindness decreed to be impossible. He had absolutely no desire or need to see in order to live his life. But the more he thought about it, the more he knew that he had to do it just to find out what seeing was like. So, Mike May chose to see. In the spring of 2001, 44 years after his brief visual world had turned to nothing, the bandages came off for a second time, and Mike May opened his eyes. He could see. Or could he? Blinding light filled his brain, a cacophony of color exploding in his mind, jagged visual sound screaming at him from every direction that wouldn't go away, that wouldn't shut up until he closed his eyes. The only way he could make it stop was to close his eyes. He opened them again, and the screaming erupted anew, flooding his consciousness and drowning out everything else, a mass of color swirling around. And then, above the roar of the brightness, he began to hear it, a voice coming from the pulsating blob of color and saying his name. It was his wife's voice, Jennifer's voice, and it was close to him, saying his name and asking him if he could see her. But this wasn't the Jennifer he knew, this swirling, ethereal, radiating glob of brightness and color. Yes, Mike answered, I can see you. Something glistened on the swirling image. Instinctively, he reached up with his fingers to feel it and discovered the wetness of his wife's tears. So this is what it is to see, Mike thought. It didn't take him long to learn color, and he was quick to spot motion, but beyond that, nothing made any sense. It was all very beautiful, what he saw, but everything required an explanation. And it was all so very tiring. After only a few minutes with his eyes open, Mike felt physically exhausted, so he would have to close them. In an odd kind of way, it was when his eyes were open that he felt really blind. He realized, he reasoned that there was more to sight than merely seeing, that it would take some time to be able to associate reality as he knew it from a life of sightlessness, to associate that reality with this new reality of images now flooding into his brain. And so, with the same undaunted courage and grit that had made him so successful as a blind person, Mike resolved that he would learn to see. What he discovered in the coming months was that learning to see was unrelenting hard work, unrelenting intellectual heavy lifting like he had never before experienced in his whole life. And he discovered that sight changed everything. Everything about the world and how it fit together and how one got along in it was now up for grabs whenever he opened his eyes. He would never have imagined it to be the way it was. If what he was looking at was still, given enough time, he could eventually figure it out. Okay, that blue stuff there is sky, those jagged things are mountains, the patchy black and white stuff is snow, and the green blobs are trees. But if the image was moving, his reasoning abilities were left hopelessly in the dust. He just couldn't keep up. He went skiing and wiped out repeatedly. He went home after only 2 runs, confused and thoroughly bruised. Nothing made sense now that he could see. Clearly, he had greatly misunderstood the world he had fully mastered as a blind person. The world was simply not the way he thought it was after all. He reasoned that if he just gave it enough time and tried harder, his seeing would improve. But after 6 months, it did not. Depression set in, and Mike thought about flushing his anti-rejection medicine down the toilet. Seeing remained for him just a bunch of multicolored shapes on his retinas. He had no face perception, no object recognition, absolutely no depth perception. What a normal person sees as shadows from which we deduce spatial orientation and depth, these were to Mike just shapes of darker color in a 2-dimensional world. The doctor said it wasn't his eyes. He was seeing 20/20. The problem, they said, had to do with his brain. Mike scheduled an appointment with some vision scientists to find out what was going on. They injected dye into his brain and then used a special kind of an MRI that could pinpoint areas of his brain that consumed oxygen when he was presented with a series of images. In other words, they would be able to see the parts of his brain where the seeing was happening. And what they discovered was fascinating. In the part of the brain where neurons should be firing to recognize color and motion, things were operating exactly as they should be. But in the part of the brain where neurons should fire when Mike was looking at pictures of faces and visual objects, nothing was happening. No oxygen burn whatsoever. The diagnosis was as grim as it was straightforward. Mike May would never learn to see. He simply had no brain function left in those areas of the brain dedicated to seeing. He could still recognize color and motion, however, and this is why. The accident that had blinded Mike happened when he was very young, at an age when scientists say the brain is still very plastic. There's lots of unassigned neurons available to process all kinds of new data coming in. The ability to distinguish color and to track motion are skills that are mastered at a very young age. Some babies can track motion at the age of only a couple of weeks. The color and the motion areas of Mike's brain had been sufficiently burned in by the time of the accident that even after 44 years of silence, they essentially sprang back to life as soon as new data started streaming in again. But object recognition is a much more highly developed brain function. And that's why kids don't start learning to read until they are 5 or 6 years old. The brain simply hasn't developed the skill needed to recognize and distinguish objects as similar and yet critically different as alphabet letters. And faces, nuances of shadow, and pictures of landscapes in books are a whole lot more complex than alphabet letters. At age 3, Mike had billions of neurons busy mastering the process of visual object recognition. But when the data flow was suddenly and permanently interrupted, those neurons began taking on other functions unrelated to sight. And as Mike got older, his brain hardened that way. It burned in that way. Because the brain becomes less plastic as we age, neurons don't reassign nearly so easily as they do when we're young. By age 46, the neurons he would have used for seeing had long ago dedicated themselves to other things, irreversibly and completely. On top of that, there were fewer neurons available in other areas of the brain to process new things as it gets older and filled up with a lifetime of learning and remembering things. In other words, we tend to use up the available space the older we get. And remember, huge amounts of brain function are needed to process sight. So, for the first time in his life that Mike could remember, he had been defeated. He would never see. I've not come to the end of Mike's story yet. I'm almost there, but this is supposed to be a sermon this morning, a spiritual message. So, before I finish with Mike, we need at least some wisdom from God's Word. So for the next couple minutes, let me suggest some parallels between Mike May's story and God's Word, and I think you will find these fascinating. See if you don't as you think about them this afternoon. And I'll share them with you by telling you the second story. There was once another man who was stricken by a terrible accident at a very young age, and he also lost his sight. That man's name is mankind. And when mankind was very young, his name was Adam and Eve. One day, long ago, in a garden, mankind tried an experiment, hoping that he could become like God, hoping to fully open his eyes so that he could know both good and evil. But the experiment exploded in his face. Although he could now see evil, what actually happened was that he became blind, so to speak, unable to continue to see reality as it really was. The reality that he had been learning to see in all its perfection and beauty when he walked and talked with God in the garden. And as mankind grew older, he lived with the memory of what that fullness of reality had been, but as time passed, the memory dimmed, and the neurons in mankind's brain that might have developed into mechanisms to process ultimate reality didn't have near as much data streaming in anymore. And so, many of them became permanently and irreversibly burned in, processing other things, things which mankind should never have had to learn, things like hatred and injustice and greed and evil and death. And as time went on, vital neurons that would have been used to process good were used to process evil instead. That was never the Creator's intention, but that was mankind's choice. And now, mankind has grown old. The brain is not nearly as elastic as it once was. So it's hard to learn new things. It's so hard to see reality now that mostly mankind just settles for blindness. It's well documented that people who have been blind for a lifetime really have no sense of spatial perception like sighted people have. Distance to a blind person is totally abstract. It's meaningless. As a blind man, Mike May thought of an airplane or a car as more like a teletransporter machine out of Star Trek. Something you get in for a period of time, it jiggles around, and when you emerge, you're someplace else. The fact that great distances have been covered is just abstract. But the truth is that distance is very real, whether or not you can perceive it. And the truth is that airplanes and cars really do go someplace. It's obvious to sighted people because they can see things going by outside the window. The visual landscape changes. Now here's the question for us. How much of true reality for us is no more than an abstract concept? For example, think about the question that that the call to worship was about today. Holiness, all right? What is holiness? We say, well, holiness is sinlessness, or holiness is being set apart for something special. On and on we go with definitions. What if holiness is way beyond that? What if holiness is something we still don't have the natural ability to process anymore? It was lost a long time ago. What if holiness is a kind of state of being that exists in a place uncontaminated by evil and that's filled and composed with nothing but absolute good? What if ultimate reality is a lot like holiness? The problem is, we live in a world fully contaminated by evil, and we've lived in it so long, and we have become so adept at living in it that we're not only used to it, but that's the way we think it should be. We can't even conceive of what it really is. We think this is normative. It is not. We're like a really smart blind man. We've become quite good at getting around in fallenness, in darkness. We've even surprised ourselves with how much we can accomplish, how much like sighted people we have become. And maybe, like Mike May, we don't really even want to see anymore. Life without sight has become that good for us. We have no idea what we're missing. We have no idea how truly dark it is. But then, every so often, reality breaks in, like what we read. In the year King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord seated on a throne, high and exalted, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him were seraphs, each with 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces. With 2 they covered their feet. And with 2 they were flying. And they were calling to one another, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. The whole earth is filled with his glory. At the sound of their voices, the doorposts and the threshold shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. Woe to me, I cried. I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty. Isaiah's life was forever changed from this point forward. And he was a good guy to begin with. Why is it that every time somebody catches a glimpse of the Lord in the Bible, or even an angel, they fall down to the ground like they're dead? Think of John, think of Daniel, think of Zechariah. Why is it whenever somebody catches a glimpse of heaven, think of Paul, or even think of Ellen White, that earth seems so dark and gloomy afterwards? Maybe it's because we have such terribly reduced capacity to process reality. We've been blind to it now for so long that whenever it breaks in, we just get overloaded. Nowadays, many people have chosen to live without any kind of religious faith, all right? Ultimate reality would make no sense even if it were suddenly to break in on those people. So many people are so sure that reality is no more than what we human beings can measure with our five senses and the wizardry of our technological tools. Evidence of anything more is just foolishness. It's just senseless. And how about us? We claim to be people of faith. How will it be for us when Jesus comes? It may be a whole lot different than we're expecting it to be. Because although we may be very clever, we don't understand near as much about genuine reality as we think we do. In fact, we know so very little. I wonder if maybe that's why Revelation 20 says there's going to be this time of healing that lasts 1,000 years. Maybe it's going to take that much time to learn to perceive reality the way we were intended to know it in the first place, way back in the beginning. I think that 1,000 years is going to be a very humbling time for us. We are going to have to unlearn everything. We've been blind and living in darkness for such a long time. And how about right now? I mean, Jesus promises that people that dare to trust him will begin to see, right? Truly. He told us that's why he came here. He said he came to preach good news to the poor, announce freedom for prisoners, recovery of sight for the blind, release for the oppressed, and he did all those things in a very literal sense when he was here. He made crippled people walk. He made corpses live again. He gave sight to blind people, some that had been blind since birth. It was one of the identifying marks of the Messiah. People knew it would only be the Messiah who could give blind people sight again. But his mission was more than just a physical mission of healing. He came to heal our spiritual blindness as well, our ability to perceive ultimate reality. In other words, Jesus came to open up our burned-in, hardened minds to what's really real, to help us see again in the fullest sense, and not just our eyes. It's got to be our minds too. And Paul writes, do not conform anymore to the pattern of this world, say, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to see, to test and approve, to perceive, in other words, what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect world. The Bible really has quite a lot to say about blindness. It's a fascinating study. New vision is available, even for old people, but we have to dare to see. Will we? God has promised us new vision if we dare to receive it. And how about Mike May? How did the story finish for him? Did he become tired of seeing? Did he grow despondent and depressed with a visual world that will forever remain for him flat and unrecognizable? Yes, he did, but only for a while. And then he decided he had a choice. He decided he could return to his world of blindness where everything was comfortable, where he had everything figured out, or he could think of a new way to learn to see. Sighted people use their eyes as their primary sense. Much of what comes in through the other senses is subordinated to what we see with our eyes. And that's how we interpret. That's how Mike May had been struggling to do life up to the time of his MRI. But then they told him he had no hope of ever doing that. He remained hopeless until a new idea began to germinate in his mind. Maybe he could learn to keep the huge impact of the visual from constantly hijacking his consciousness. Maybe he could learn to subordinate his vision to his other senses. Maybe he could use hearing as his primary sense, and his brain would begin to sort it out, and he could learn to see all over again, like a baby. It was a long shot, but it was worth a try, and slowly it began to work. Mike May began to truly see. And today, he is able to pick out a face in a room full of faces. He no longer trips as much over curbs when he's crossing the street. He's even learned to ski moguls again with his eyes open, as long as he pays really careful attention to the sound his skis are making on the snow. And slowly, the visual images are becoming more automatic, because in a way, he allowed his mind to be transformed to a new way of thinking. And for those of us who follow Jesus, maybe that's what it's all about. Maybe that's what faith is. Allowing our minds to be transformed to a new way of thinking where the really real can break through more and more and more. It's worth thinking about.
Wow. It's my prayer that God will open our minds so that we can see anew. Stand with me as we sing "Open My Eyes That I May See," hymn number 326, if you'd like to use your hymnals. Open my eyes that I may see glimpses of truth thou hast for me. Place in my hands the wonderful key that shall unclasp and set me free. Silently now I wait for thee, ready, my God, thy will to see. Open my eyes, illumine me, Spirit divine. Open my ears that I may hear voices of truth thou sendest clear. And while the wave notes fall on my ear, everything false will disappear. Silently now I wait for thee, ready, my God, thy will to see. Open my ears, illumine me, Spirit divine. Open my mouth and let me bear gladly the warm truth everywhere. Open my heart and let me prepare love with thy children thus silently now I wait for thee. Ready, my God, thy will to see. Open my heart, illumine me. Spirit divine.
Let's pray. We confess, Lord, that we have become pretty good at living in a world of darkness and fallenness. And sometimes we don't even care to see what's beyond. And we think we have everything that's beyond all figured out. And so we ask that your Spirit will send us illumination, that we can begin to see a little bit more of what you would like us to understand about who you are and what heaven is and what our tasks are here on earth while we're living and what life is all about. We look forward to being able to process again the way you made us way back at the very beginning. It's been a long time. We're pretty old. And so we look forward to your coming. Look forward to that time that we can heal and learn to see again. Thank you for the promise that you will send us your Spirit. You're eager to do that. We ask for it and we accept it. And we look forward to your coming again soon, where you say every eye is going to see you. We don't know how that's going to work, but we trust that it's true. And we hope that we're alive on that day too when you come. We ask in your name. Amen.
Amen.